This week's Africa Weekly Record is a lighter edition. But even during a quieter week, larger structural systems continue moving underneath the headlines. Trade corridors are expanding, debt pressure remains high, and governments across Africa are increasingly trying to negotiate not only growth but the terms under which growth is financed, routed, and controlled. This week's episode examines corridors, financing pressure, and Africa's changing negotiating position inside a shifting global economy. Mozambique approved several strategic transport and fuel infrastructure projects this week, linked to regional trade and logistics systems. The developments include port expansion, hazardous cargo handling infrastructure, fuel terminal upgrades, and corridor projects designed to strengthen connections into wider southern African markets. And this reflects a broader continental pattern. Across East and Southern Africa, ports, railways, inland freight systems, and logistics corridors are increasingly becoming strategic assets, rather than simple infrastructure projects. Because trade routes now shape leverage as much as resources themselves, governments, investors, and external partners are all competing to influence how goods, minerals, fuel, and industrial products move across African systems. And as global shipping pressures continue, reshaping logistics calculations, corridor resilience is becoming economically and geopolitically significant. The United Nations now projects stronger economic growth across parts of Africa during 2026 and 2027. East Africa is expected to remain one of the continent's strongest performing regions, supported by infrastructure investment, renewable energy expansion, and regional integration. But stronger growth forecasts do not remove structural pressure. Debt servicing costs remain high across multiple economies. Interest payments continue absorbing significant portions of government revenue, and refinancing conditions remain tighter than during earlier recovery periods. At the same time, parts of the Eurobond market have cautiously reopened for some African sovereigns after a prolonged financing freeze. That may reduce immediate refinancing pressure for stronger issuers, but it also highlights a growing divide between economies regaining market access and those still navigating restructuring negotiations or debt distress. And this is why growth and pressure now coexist at the same time across much of the continent. At the Africa Forward Summit in Nairobi, African leaders and international partners focused heavily on industrialization, debt reform, AI sovereignty, and local value addition. The wider message was increasingly clear. African governments do not simply want to export raw materials. They are increasingly seeking larger roles inside manufacturing, digital infrastructure, processing, and strategic supply chains. The summit also reflected wider discussions around debt reform, financing costs, regional integration, and bargaining power inside a changing global economy. At the same time, global trade systems themselves are becoming more fragmented and competitive. That creates risks, but it also creates opportunities for African states attempting to negotiate across multiple partners, rather than relying on a single economic bloc. And that means the deeper issue is no longer simply whether African economies will grow. It is increasingly under whose terms. Elsewhere this week, discussions around AfCFTA implementation and regional trade integration continued across multiple African institutions. In Kenya, protests and transport disruption linked to rising fuel prices highlighted how quickly global energy pressure can move through transport, household, and logistics systems inside fuel importing economies. Meanwhile, financing pressure and debt sustainability remain central concerns for economies navigating restructuring negotiations and tighter borrowing conditions. And across several regions, logistics resilience, industrial policy, and strategic infrastructure continue shaping long-term economic planning. This week's pattern is becoming increasingly visible. Infrastructure, trade routes, debt systems, fuel corridors, industrial policy, and strategic leverage are all becoming more connected. African economies are not operating in isolation from global pressure, but they are increasingly attempting to negotiate more space inside it. And that means the struggle over growth is also becoming a struggle over routes, financing conditions, and who ultimately shapes the terms.